Scoot in just a little bit. I have a secret for you. Being a new dad means you're going to have a lot less time to do things like game. Because you have a lot less time to game, does that mean you should get an Xbox Series S, assuming you can find one? Find out what my thoughts are after having it for 5 months and whether you should buy one too. Coming up. Hey, I'm Sam with Systems of Impact. The place for dads, buy a new dad. The effort involved in getting an Xbox Series X was relatively in-depth. I needed to go through and I followed Wario64 on Twitter, looked at all the different places that were storing or having their stock supplemented, and then diving into a bunch of different tabs and just trying to get something into the cart to check out. And it took, decent amount of time, but I was finally fortunate enough to get a Series X to go through and get it on launch day. Now, because of that, I do have some dislikes and likes, and let's start with the dislikes first. So the first thing I really don't like about the Series X is there's just no exclusive games for it. There's nothing even coming in the relatively near term in most cases. So from a Series X perspective, there's just nothing that is coming out that is really going to move Series X consoles at this particular point in time. When you're looking at a lot of the exclusive titles that have been shown, a lot of those are still relatively far out. And even Halo Infinite, which is technically delayed until this year, who knows if that's going to actually come out or not. I prefer that if it's not ready, that it does not pull a Cyberpunk 2077 and just release horrifically broken, but that it actually releases when it's ready to be released. So that way I can actually enjoy the game. Another thing I really don't like is that although the Series X is the most powerful console on the market, there's really nothing that can take advantage of that power. A lot of developers that are going through and developing for the Series X are having to relearn a new back-end architecture, which then is causing issues because the PS5 ended up keeping a lot of the same stuff. So it's relatively easy for developers to just run with it, so to speak. Whereas the Series X are having to relearn a lot of these things. So to squeeze all that extra power out of the Series X is relatively difficult. And based upon what Digital Foundry has said, the PS5 third-party titles are actually performing better on that platform than the Series X right now. The next thing I'm not the biggest fan of is the UI. If you're a fan of the UI from the Xbox One days, then you're gonna love the Series X and the Series S. If you are not a fan, there's nothing new here. So you're gonna continue not liking the UI. Another thing I'm not the biggest fan of, and this is both a con and a pro, but Quick Resume. For the most part, Quick Resume hasn't really worked for me, so I haven't really seen it in too much action, but when it did work, it was actually incredibly convenient. But for the most part, hasn't been working, so it's going in the con list as well. Now, here is one of the particular cons, and it's not necessarily the biggest con, but it's definitely up there, and that is the storage expansion for the Series X. At least it has one. So that'll end up being in the pro in a minute. But the con side is that it is relatively expensive. The 1 terabyte expansion drive, you're looking at, it's over $200 as of the recording of this video. It allows you to have the same speed as you do on the internal storage. But again, it is a little bit pricey. So that is something that you need to take into account. Now, my last con is kind of an all-encompassing one, is that the Series X has a very high barrier of entry. And what I mean by that is it is relatively pricey to jump into this ecosystem. You have the price of the console. You have the price of the storage expansion if you want to have more expansion. You also have the price of the TV. And this is where many people end up missing this boat, is that to fully take advantage of the Series X, you have to have a TV that is 4K, that has HDR, and has HDMI 2.1. From a TV perspective, a lot of those TVs are still relatively expensive. So this is something that you have to take into account, that even on the monitor side of things, in case you're trying to hook this up through a monitor, even monitors are barely hitting the HDMI 2.1 capability. So you're looking at, from a price point perspective, it is a very high barrier of entry for most people. So that is something you really need to keep in mind. Now let's jump into the things I really do like about the Series X. And the first thing I love about it is that all my peripherals work. Now, I am the biggest fan of the Xbox controller. The offset thumbs just fit my hands just way better than the DualShock or even the new DualShock. It is just super comfortable for me. And regardless if I have an Xbox One or I'm using the Series X, my controllers will just work. I can go ahead and sync them across the entire line of Xbox systems. So Xbox One, Xbox One S, Xbox Series S, Xbox Series X. It's confusing as hell, I know, but what can you do? I don't own Xbox. But the key thing here is that all my peripherals will still work. The only caveat to that is the Kinect, but let's be honest, nobody's using that thing anyway, so. Next thing I really like, and this was a con, but it's also a pro, is that when Quick Resume works, it is awesome. Going ahead and jumping into Assassin's Creed Valhalla and it only taking you seconds to pick up where you left off after quitting like Warzone or something else is such a cool concept, and I love when it works. Another thing I really like, and that's just because I am an early adopter and I do like the latest and greatest, the Series X is the most powerful console on the market. So once third parties actually have the ability to really squeeze all of that performance out of that console, then you're going to start to really see the performance gains out of the Series X. Granted, we're probably still a couple of years away from that, but the concept that it has the ability to do that, I absolutely love, and it's a little bit of future proofing down the road. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is backwards compatibility. This is something that Microsoft and Sony have taken very different stances on. And Sony's kind of coming around to it a little bit, but Microsoft wants your games to work across whatever platform you choose to play on. So, and I'll get into some of these pros in just a minute, but for the backwards compatibility piece, if I have a game from the Xbox One days, like Fusion Frenzy, for example, that will still work on my Series X. It will not only play the latest and greatest games, but it'll also play a lot of the back catalog. So for me personally, that means that all of the investment that I've made into the Xbox ecosystem up to this point is still viable, and I absolutely love that pro consumer choice. Now, speaking of games, that brings me to the slate of games that Microsoft has coming up. You're talking things like Halo Infinite, Avowed, Bright Memory Infinite, Hellblade 2, Stalker 2, and then an entire slew of games that we haven't even been announced yet, that we have no idea of what they are. And from 30 plus Microsoft studios, you can guarantee that there are going to be a lot of games that are in the pipe that are just going to be awesome. But again, this kind of plays back into the con where initially there's just not a lot of games available, but over time you're going to start to see a slew of games, and they're going to be coming out on a consistent basis. That's the time period that I'm really talking about here that is going to be awesome in the Xbox ecosystem. Now, I mentioned this in the cons section, but it's also a pro that Xbox allows you to expand your storage. So you're not just stuck with the internal storage on the system itself, but you can also expand that storage by another terabyte. Again, keep in mind it is a little pricey, but you at least have the option to do so if that's something that you're actually wanting to do. And that brings me to another piece, and this is Microsoft's infrastructure. And I know this doesn't get a lot of praise because it either isn't very well known or that it's not the glitz and the glamour like a game would be. But for me personally, the infrastructure that Xbox has managed to really create here is something magical. So for example, cross-gen saves. I can go ahead and fire up Hitman 3 on my Xbox One, and then I can go ahead, play a little bit, save it, go to my Series X, and that save will allow me to just pick it right up on the Series X. I don't have to think twice about it. It just works. Another piece of that infrastructure that is commonly overlooked is cloud game streaming. It was already available on Android, but now they're moving over to web and iOS. Being able to play the games that you own and just stream them to whatever you're working on, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a browser or whatever, having that ability to stream is another amazing ability from an infrastructure standpoint. That also brings me to smart delivery. Whether I have an Xbox One or I have a Series X, it will automatically look at which console I have and then download the appropriate game for that console. I don't have to sit there and guess and figure out which one I have to download. I don't have to go into some menu setting to figure it out. I don't have to, figure out what save I need to transfer over, some jury-rigged ability to do so. It just works. And this kind of infrastructure is commonly, like I said, overlooked, but it is such a big piece of what makes Microsoft what it is today. And that takes me directly into the biggest thing as far as a pro is concerned, Xbox Game Pass. Xbox Game Pass is one of those things where it not only gives you the ability to play a bunch of different games, but if you're on the Series X, it also improves performance on a lot of those titles, especially backwards compatible. And it doesn't require anything from the developer to enable. Microsoft goes ahead and does that. So Game Pass by itself is awesome. If you have the Ultimate version, then you're also looking at the ability to look at EA games as well as PC games. So you're looking at even more games to be able to play on different devices of your choosing. Xbox Game Pass really is the best value in gaming today, hands down, period. If you're finding value in today's video, make sure to hit that like button. And if you know of somebody that is thinking about getting a Series X, make sure to share this video so that way it can help them out and decide whether this is the best route for them or not. And that brings me full circle. Should you actually buy an Xbox Series X? No. Most cases, you shouldn't. There is literally no reason to buy a Series X for most people. My overall suggestion is Series X is going to be a very high price point of entry. So you're looking at the Series X by itself and potentially a TV. Now, if you like the latest and greatest and that's the route that you want to go like I did, jump wholeheartedly into it, do it. It'll take you a little bit to get through those supply issues, but it is going to be well worth it. For everybody else, you're going to be wanting to look at if you have an Xbox One or an Xbox One S, I would highly recommend going with the Xbox Series S. It'll give you a better price per performance. You can play all those games. You still get a lot of the performance upgrades that the Series X does, but on the Series S, and you can still play a lot of the latest and greatest and not take such a hit to performance like you would with like a potential Xbox One. Now, if you have an Xbox One X, this is where you're kind of in that middle ground because you had the latest and greatest, but now it's not quite that anymore. So if you were in that camp, I would actually stay with the Xbox One X. I wouldn't upgrade to a Series S. I would wait for the Series X to become more prevalent. Then I would go ahead and pull the trigger on that one. Otherwise, stick with what you have. It's going to be the best for the short-term solution. Now I want to hear from you. Have you managed to snag a Series X? And if you did, what has been your experience so far? Make sure to put that in the comments below. Now make sure to stay tuned for next week because I'm going to be covering the PS5 and what it's like owning that for 5 months. So stay tuned for that and I'll see you in those other videos.